In this video, we're going to take a look here at Matthew chapter 5, and I'm going to just be focusing here on the verses that start with verse 13. Previously, I've already looked at the Beatitudes. So here we're going to look at Matthew 5:13 to the end of the chapter. So just highlight a few of the things that Jesus is challenging his disciples to do. Well, in verses 13 through 16, he's encouraging them to be salt and light. And of course, these items as metaphors raise a lot of kind of discussion, certainly because salt can be used symbolically for lots of different things, as well as light seems to indicate the idea of bringing truth. Now, salt can have the idea of doing something with making something holy, or can have a preservative element to it. So if you are the salt of the earth, you could be preserving the earth in some way. And so by the disciples' righteousness, the world is preserved. Or it can be, since it can have an effect, it can make something sacred. The disciples' righteousness, their goodness, their lives can have a positive impact. It can, as it were, affect the status of the world. So salt has various metaphorical meanings. I've seen a commentary that listed, something like 15 different metaphorical meanings for salt. In connection with light, well, light is oftentimes used in the Old Testament to this idea of that which is true. God's light shines in darkness, so darkness is oftentimes a metaphor for ignorance, and not only ignorance, but also immorality. So it goes to this idea that if one can see, one would choose to do the good, but if one is in the dark, one can't see, and one chooses to do the bad. So darkness is associated with ignorance and with immorality, whereas light is seen as knowledge or truthfulness and goodness. So the disciples being light in the world, it brings truth, or it brings insight to the world. The world is seen then as a place of darkness. So Jesus encourages his disciples then to be a light to the world. In other words, to let their knowledge of God, or let their knowledge of what is true, or let their knowledge of the good that should be done, let that be shown to the world, and especially that people can see good works and give glory to the Father in heaven. So this light is the good actions then that are being displayed because of what they know about God. Then in verse 17 through 20, this teaching about following the law and the prophets, and it needs to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. So here in Matthew's gospel, while Pharisees are oftentimes seen as opponents of Jesus, this saying is actually kind of recognizing a certain level of righteousness that the Pharisees practice. In other words, they do practice a certain loyalty to the law and observance of the law. Jesus is not saying this sarcastically. This is not well, the Pharisees don't have any righteousness at all, so you're going to be righteous while they are not. No, the Pharisees have a very high standard of trying to be faithful to the law, particularly in areas that help to distinguish Jews from non-Jews. So their commitment to observance of the Sabbath, their commitment to ceremonial issues, cleansing issues. But Jesus wants their righteousness to exceed that. Now, very oftentimes what Jesus means is having to do with other laws that he criticizes Pharisees for not practicing. So later on in Matthew's gospel, he will chastise the Pharisees for practicing certain laws, but that are minor, while neglecting what he calls weightier matters of the law. So, they're supposed to practice mercy. They're supposed to practice justice, and they're not practicing these things while they're maybe practicing some other things. So Jesus says, you ought to have done these things while not neglecting the others. So for Jesus, is not a kind of either or. You either do these things or you do those. He sees that their law observance in some areas is correct. Now he will challenge them on certain observances and certain issues throughout Matthew's gospel, but he does recognize a level of righteousness. But his disciples are going to follow the law and prophets, more fully, particularly because of these things like mercy and compassion and justice that are called for. Jesus did not come to get rid of the law. He did not come to abolish, but to fulfill them. And so whatever someone might think fulfill means, it can't mean abolish. So you can't say, well, Jesus fulfills the law and thus he has abolished it. Matthew's audience does not think of the law as being abolished. These are likely Jewish Christians who are still observing the law, but they think that they're observing the law more fully or more completely than what the Pharisees are doing. So then from verses 21 through 48, in one way this is kind of illustrating how their righteousness is going to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, because there are things that the law requires that can sometimes get neglected. So Jesus does this kind of contrasting here. These are sometimes called the Badaise sayings, or in some translations they may actually title them the antitheses. Well, you have to be careful calling this section the antitheses, because what Jesus is doing here is he is actually quoting, in many of the instances, he is quoting from the law, which is given by God. So, for instance, in verse 21, when he talks about, he's going to talk about this section on anger, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder. Well, who said you shall not murder? Well, it was said by God. God said, thou shalt not murder. And so to those of ancient times, this is a way of indicating the value of this statement. In other words, because this has been around for a long time, it therefore is a valuable teaching. In other words, you shall not murder is God's law, it's God's will, you ought to obey it. But if you think that just, saying, I haven't murdered, so I'm good with God, no, God's law against murder, there is also God's law against anger. And so God's will doesn't mean that you can be angry with your brother or sister, with somebody within the community, and think that, well, at least I haven't murdered them. You still have an issue that you have to resolve. There's still sin that has to be dealt with. And so if you're going around and saying things verbally and not dealing with uh, your relationship with that person, seeking reconciliation, then you're not complying to God's will. Well, there's an interesting teaching here as well in Matthew 5. It has to do with Matthew 5:23. So what's happened here in these few verses is several kind of different teachings of Jesus have been stitched together. And this one teaching, verse 23, so when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go first be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Now, so what Jesus is teaching here is something that other, rabbis or other teachers would have also taught, that, the way that God's forgiveness works is if you have sinned against someone. So in this case, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, meaning you have done something against them, you have sinned against them in some way. So there imagining this person who comes to the altar, who brings a sacrifice because they know that they have sinned and they want God's forgiveness, but the person that they have sinned against, they've not gone to that person. So what they need to do is just leave their altar there, or leave their sacrifice there at the altar, go try to be reconciled with that person they sinned against. Now, if the person doesn't want to be reconciled with them, well, that's that person's decision. But you should go and make amends for whatever sin has been committed. Then, after you have done that, you can come to God and seek God's forgiveness. But don't be seeking God's forgiveness before you have taken responsibility for your sin that you have committed against someone. So, whereas in the first few verses talking about the anger that you might have towards somebody, these verses have to do with the anger that someone might have against you because of sin that you have committed against them. And so then this section also ends with this kind of common sense of you want to try and find common ground or find reconciliation with those who want to accuse you. Now, again, there are these people who are angry with you. And so you don't want to trust the courts, because the courts could end up siding against you and you could be in a worse situation. So, these people, have an issue with you, something has been done, you try to reconcile that, work that out before going to the courts. Then you have the condemning of lust. And so, you have heard that it was said, so in other words, by God, you should not commit adultery. So when Jesus talks about lust here, he's not saying that lust is the same thing as adultery. So adultery is a terrible sin. Lust is also a problem. So just because you haven't committed adultery doesn't mean that you're okay. Now, by lust, who looks at it with lust. So this concept of lust is this idea of desiring to have. So what Jesus is not condemning is you see um, another man's wife and you uh, note her beauty, or you note something about her. You see kind of an attraction there. That's not the condemnation. The condemnation is lust, which is this idea of wanting to desire to have, to set one's eye upon. It conveys something similar to the concept of being covetous. So wanting to have what belongs to someone else. So one of the things interesting about adultery, just kind of an aside, within Jesus' day, adultery, technically in Jesus' day, well, there was differences between when a woman commits adultery and a man commits adultery. Women commit adultery when a married woman commits adultery when she has sex with anyone besides her husband. But men commit adultery when they have sex with another man's wife. That's when they have adultery. So they don't commit adultery technically when um, when they have sex with another woman who is unmarried, even though they are married. Now, that behavior is known as fornication. So it's still a sin. It's not that it's not sinful, it's just not under the kind of category of adultery. So women can commit adultery against their marriage when they have sex with anybody else. Men commit adultery against another man's marriage. So anyway, so we have the teaching that condemns lust, and we also have a condemnation against unlawful divorces. I'm not going to get into the weeds of this very difficult passage. There may be other opportunities where I will talk more about Jesus' teaching about divorce and remarriage. But generally speaking, here in the Matthean version, both here and later on in Matthew. Um, Gospel where Jesus talks about a divorce and remarriage, we have what was called an exception clause. So, what Jesus condemns is unlawful divorces. That is where a man gets a divorce. So, in the Jewish custom, what has to happen is a man writes a document, and this document would be known as the Git, Git in English, and he gives it to her. Now, this is all based upon Deuteronomy 24, this kind of instructions, which is really not a law about divorce, it's a law about remarriage. But in it, there is this expectation that when a man is going to divorce his wife, that he must give her this Git. And it does have, it states that if he sees something unseemly in her. So this phrase unseemly in Deuteronomy 24 gets understood differently by the different teachers at the time. So someone like a Rabbi Hillel, a rabbi who lived before the time of Jesus, thought that unseemly means, was quite broad, so that a man could divorce his wife for almost any cause, as long as it's something that displeased him. Whereas Rabbi Shammai, another rabbi, he taught that the unseemly referred to specifically um, some kind of fornication, some kind of sexual sin. And so if he finds out, a man finds out that his wife has been involved in sinful and sexual misconduct, then he should divorce her. The expectation almost is that she will divorce him. We actually, interestingly, have a early Christian document that seems to almost presume that Christians will divorce, a Christian man will divorce his wife if he finds that she has committed some kind of sexual misbehavior. So, but an unlawful divorce would be when a man divorces his wife not for the grounds of something unseemly, or in this case, not on the grounds of, language sometimes can be unchastity, sexual unfaithfulness, or some kind of unfaithfulness. What's sometimes translated by the different English translations is translating a Greek word porneia, which is where we get our word pornography from, and it can be used specifically for adultery, but it also can be used quite broadly for sexual misconduct. So that still can be a large umbrella. What is meant by sexual misconduct? What constitutes sexual misconduct? But for Jesus, in the Matthean version, at least, it's divorce has to be in line with what Moses has taught. So you shouldn't be divorcing your spouse just for any reason whatsoever. So, in other words, Jesus is opposed to the way in which Rabbi Hillel would have interpreted the passage. This teaching here in Matthew is more in line with what we find from Rabbi Shammai. And then we also have the teaching about marrying a woman who has been divorced. So you don't want to, whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So that last statement is quite challenging. I can't go into all the details why I interpret it this one way, but basically the way I understand it is adultery is a category, and when a man marries a divorced woman, and it doesn't matter why she was divorced, she may have been divorced unlawfully, she may have been divorced lawfully. But if he marries a divorced woman, then he is engaging in this category that is understood as adultery. So this is a rather hard teaching of Jesus for us. Certainly, as modern people try to think about what this teaching might mean for their marital situations. But we need to appreciate that in Jesus' day, there are these kind of categories, and particularly like with the priesthood, the high priest can't marry a woman who has been divorced or who's committed adultery. And so the idea of adultery and divorce are kind of put into the same kind of camp. And here Jesus is expecting his disciples to follow a very high standard where they don't um, marry someone who has been divorced. And if they do, then they're involved into this particular kind of category. So it's not that disciples can't be involved in this category. They can be, but this is Jesus' teaching is that they shouldn't be. So that's a condemnation of unlawful divorces. Then a condemning of dishonesty. So you have heard that it was said, you shall not swear falsely. Again, this is a teaching of Jesus. But if you make a swearing here, it has to do not with like saying swear words, but it is taking an oath. And oftentimes oaths were taken with the understanding that if you don't fulfill your vow, then God, who you take the oath to, will discipline you in some way. Now, some people, though, want it to try and take oaths, not invoking God's name, which would make it a very serious oath, but instead they would invoke other things. So Jesus refers to heaven. Well, if a person takes an oath by heaven, it's a bit misleading because it sounds like you're taking a very serious oath because heaven is God's domain, but you haven't invoked technically God's name. So someone might be thinking, "Oh, I can swear by heaven, and if I don't fulfill my vow, well then I haven't invoked God's name, and I'm taking God's name in vain." So it's kind of a way of trying to make people believe that you're serious about fulfilling a vow, but you want to leave room to be able to escape the vow and not expect any kind of punishment for that. So it's really a condemnation against dishonesty. Instead, you should just go ahead and tell people what it is you're going to do, or tell people what it is you're not going to do, and anything else where you're trying to leave the impression that you might do something when you don't really have the intention, that's dishonesty. So you can't say, well, I have not committed perjury. I've not sworn, falsely by God's name, but you are engaged in dishonesty. So there's still sin that has to be dealt with. So Jesus is not getting rid of don't swear falsely, but as a law, but he is trying to teach, there's a standard that the law requires beyond that one particular commandment. Also, verse 38, then you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Again, this is in God's law. This is not a man-made idea. And but what Jesus is concerned here with is taking this proverbial statement that comes from the law, and in the context in which it was used. So someone might want to look where the statement actually comes from, something like Leviticus 24:20, and what Jesus is in the text, in the law, an eye for an eye and tooth for tooth is never put out there as something that people followed literally. In other words, they didn't go around, if you took out one person's eye, they went out and took your eye. The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth conveys in figurative language the concept of just compensation. So if someone has injured you in some way, you have a right to just compensation for that injury. And you should not expect more than what is the just compensation. So in the passage where this proverbial saying is used, it talks about, if your ox gore, uh, you know, your ox, or an animal, something injures your animal, you have a right to an equivalent animal of equivalent health. You shouldn't be given a sicker animal than the animal that you have, or a maimed animal than the one that you have. So you have a right for um, just compensation. Jesus is not getting rid of eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He certainly doesn't think people should be actually taking people's eyes out or taking people's teeth out of uh, some kind of vendetta. But you shouldn't be using this passage, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that is a part of God's law, and then using it as a justification for personal vengeance. That's not the intent of the law. So if you decide to go after people for the harm that has been done to you, then you're not really fulfilling God's will either. And so you need to instead have a different attitude, and the attitude should be you would want to try and do good towards people, even those people who hurt you. You try to find ways that you can resist wanting to retaliate. You try to find ways of doing good to those um, for who might be trying to oppress you or oppose you. And then this section ends with affirming love for one's enemies. So verses 43 through 44. Now, there isn't a law that says hate your enemy. There is the law out of Leviticus to you shall love your neighbor. Now, hate your enemy may be an interpretation that some have arisen, and certainly one that Jesus can condemn. So instead of hating your enemy, so to hate means within this Jewish context means I want bad to happen to that person. So Jesus doesn't expect disciples to have the same kind of feelings um, about an enemy that they have about their loved ones or that they have about close families and close friends. That's not the expectation. But if you love, you're not wanting harm to come to that person. So if you hate your enemy, you're wanting harm to come to them. So, but instead of hating your enemies, you are to love. Now, this truly is one of the distinctive things in Jesus' teachings. We don't really have, and this one of the most fascinating things in this is we don't have prior to Jesus a Jewish teacher that says, that instructs other Jews to love their enemies. So, a lot of the things that Jesus teaches, we can find other teachers before him who taught basically the same thing. But this teaching does seem to be quite distinctive, quite new. So, so to love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. In this way, you're like your Father in heaven, because God does good even to those who hate God, and so too we ought to do good to those who hate us or who would want to harm us. If you just love those who love you back, there's not much. That's not a very high standard. But instead, if you will do good to those who want to hurt you, you are living at a greater righteousness and a greater standard, more in compliance to God's will, as Jesus understood that will as revealed in Torah. So it concludes with being perfect. So the idea of perfection here in Matthew's gospel is maybe not the same thing as what within Greek thought perfection means, but perfection has this idea of maturity. And so we ought to be mature in our righteousness because our Heavenly Father is mature in his righteousness. It reflects something of that teaching we find in places like Leviticus, where, to be holy because God is holy. Well, we're supposed to have this kind of righteousness that is above the standard that so many people follow, because certainly God's righteousness is above the standard that so many people follow. So in that's a quick kind of review, insights then on Jesus' teachings in Matthew chapter 5.